TLC is such a great program, but you really have to respect it to use it. It's one people's main problem with computing technology is they have no respect for it. Unfortunately. Why would they, though? Conversation between a 6-year-old version of me and whatever other version of me. 16 is a milestone. It's huge. Okay, there. My personal protective gear. Honestly, just keeping dust out of my eyes. And eyelashes and such. I really love what I did with the place. Trying. Yeah. Okay. It's looking good. I was worried for a second. I'm not gonna lie. A part of me was really scared we wouldn't be able to do this. I thought for a really long time about white women's ineffectiveness as solidarity builders. And I've decided it's mostly a perception issue. I think they're pretty effective. I think it's just that we don't perceive it in that way. Especially time and place, like at the time they're being effective or in the place they're being effective. That part is widely distorted, and for a lot of women that actually really works on their behalf. So there's plenty of people whose secrets I'm just like not going to expose if I think it's working for them and they're like, you know, being effective. I'm not going to comment on it. Ooh. But oh my god, my commentary is pretty brutal, isn't it? Pretty brutal. Re-listening to it, gosh, well, you know, and I want to be a sensitive, soft creature, so I'm like, oh, you were so mean. You know, like a lot of the time, that's how I feel about stuff, and I'm like, that wasn't mean, that was like an honest assessment. It's okay. Like, it's okay. I have to, like, talk myself through this. Like, it wasn't mean. Biased, certainly, I'm sure. There's plenty that can be said about who I am as a person. Unfortunately, when you decide to address the world, you'll be judged by a very large standard. There's no possible way I could ever measure up. Like, I'm not perfect. I am a very, not even fallible, but imperfect. I'm an imperfect person because that's the whole point. So one of the things I thought I would start with is this idea of what is human error and why is it so magical. I think we have done quite a bit of discussion surrounding probability, futurism, divination, prediction, universe creation, dimension shifting, everything that mathematically is implied by our current understanding of physics. And I think I freaked a lot of people out because I did talk a lot about the mathematical implications of our current understanding of different areas of math. And I think people are not used to the average person having access to the type of information that could allow them to become like a self-made, from a philosophical standpoint, mathematician. I have absolutely not even a tenth of the discipline it takes to be a mathematician, and I'm not one. But it's the philosophy of it. The foundational tools are all there, and it was an exceptional set of circumstances that allowed me to have access to those tools and to put them together the way that I did. And I'm an exceptional creature in a variety of ways, and all that's super cool. But at the same time, I like freaked a lot of people out with my synergy of math and social sciences, history, language arts, all of those cool enrichment tools I was given by people we were supposed to ignore and or resent or hate. So yeah, it's just a really weird system that's designed to like make combative citizenry. And I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, just thinking about our history as a country. How was America the nation that accepted like every immigrant from every country? How was that supposed to have firm borders or like any sort of centralized governance? And I'm not saying centralized governance is necessarily the right call at this point. I think the genius of a city-state government organization involves a certain amount of autonomy on behalf of the states. That's kind of what makes it nice, and it also makes it possible for the states to choose what's right for them. In their region, the people who live in their region, that's the whole point of governance. And so if a decentralized means of governance becomes a way in which the American system can be operationalized on behalf of the people, then maybe we should revert to city-state federation behaviors, and every state should decide for themselves, and then everybody should come back together if they want to create a union. I don't know. Apparently federation these days is all the fucking rage. But anyway, yeah, so this synergy has been impressive, exciting, exhausting, crushing, very open to critique and criticism. So much of what I have shared is very criticizable. Didn't not think about that. Just figured it was worth saying in case the right ears heard them. And of course, my idea of the right audience are future-oriented, positive thinking individuals who take responsibility over their presence in the world, whatever that looks like for them, and their places and their choices. Oof. Yeah, gosh. A lot of just thinking and feeling, wandering my way to points, feeling out the room in response to everything I said, super important. Also, taking a break from the live recording processy thing just meant rebuilding a new type of water wheel that will allow me to do audio and video, not necessarily simultaneously, but together, across multiple, spreading across different platforms, different organizational practices, hopefully compressing some of my processes to get eke some more time out of it. And it's been going well, lots of cool experiences with all that, but also just kind of one of the mathematical implications that I have been dwelling on has been like the logical continuation of certain progressing events, probabilistically speaking. Yeah, being able to synergize multiple forms of math and apply it to social frameworks. It's scary. It's cool. That's what education is all about. That is the whole point of interdisciplinary collaboration, is the synergy of different disciplines in rapid response formats. That's one reason I tend to trust academia more than I trust the mob, governments, or media. But one of the struggles there is that academia can be used to justify a whole lot of horrific shit, and people don't take as much responsibility for that as they really should in their day-to-day lives. Part of that, I feel, is due to the way that academics and academia has been pigeonholed in our society as a certain type of person. But I do think there is a certain amount of self-serving laziness, circle jerking that goes on in academia that it would be really appropriate to just end. But that's obviously my perspective. Yeah, one of the biggest criticisms that I can like feel coming back at me is that of like being a harpy or like harping on stuff, and I'm like, right. I'm like getting online to harp on some stuff with y'all. Like that's the whole point, is like just affirming how excruciatingly fixable all of our collectively held struggles are, and like reiterating how we can do something about that. That's like the whole point. That is 100%. It is harpy status over here. Somebody draw me with wings. But otherwise, pretty good. I'm really excited about the food. Really food motivated. Obviously, we all know this. What else was I gonna say? Oh yeah, so just to kind of conclude some of the different things that were brought up during the last news cycle, the cozy media news cycle, is really this entreaty to let me be your media is more like an offer of being a safe space for you to like better perfect your attentionality, self-regulation capacity when it comes to intaking information and media. The idea is that I'm creating something that is intentionally somewhat ambiguous, intentionally soothing, so that it can help to regulate in a way that makes you feel there is companionship, there is validation of your experiences, there is shared suffering, although not proportionately shared suffering, right? And there's just like a experience of being seen, because that is the baseline for human connection and the way in which we are interdependent to one another. And one of the things that I have really noticed as I've like gone off into the stratosphere, becoming a machine, cognitively speaking, creating a lot of internal routines for me to default to, and then just doing that for a long period of time, becoming more mechanistic in my behaviors, and in all other ways, like kind of automating certain things, and then working really hard to kind of like re-embody my living experience in a way where that kind of automation is no longer the default, and reinvestigating how those decisions were made, and like, are we still down with this type of automation, or this like corner cutting, or these like decision, all of this super fun stuff. Oh gosh, I lost my train of thought again. I'm not even high. That's the sad thing. Like, I was like, no, we can't be high while we do easy to lose our train of thought right now. Like again with the string instruments, I know that the string instrument people have got my back because I'm a string instrument person, but like it's a little much. And unfortunately, when you're this like overly sensitive, a lot of overly sensitive. People say overly sensitive, they mean like you're literally not going to be able to function this really rough and desensitizing world. Like, well, yeah, I didn't want to function in a place of desensitization. I wanted to continue to be sensitive and open and feeling. That was the point. That was the hope. So, yeah, oversensitive, okay. But this ability to be so sensitive to perceived perceptions of others on topics and be relatively accurate in your predictions about the way that you heard in a way that allows you to reflexively in the moment generate what you're saying as though you were talking to somebody who is right in front of you. That takes a lot of work. Yeah, a lot of interrogation of the machine of the human mind, I'll tell you what. But I feel like I got a lot of cool insights, and because I started out as somebody who was really like just about technology and an enjoyer of design tools, it really kept me oriented towards like this is still not as sophisticated of a machine as the human like psyche. And I think that that's one of the biggest threats that AI is casting the shadow of in the public discourse right now, but it's kind of getting more to the root of it. Like, the biggest psychological threat a lot of us face when it comes to deeply sophisticated machines is a feeling of inferiority, that our minds are just never going to be as sophisticated as all of these other things. And part of that, to me at least, this is just me kind of riffing, but part of that is the amount of screens that you have. I had a family member who asked me why I had 5 screens, and I was really just flabbergasted. I know I've told you this before. Technically, I have 7 screens, 9 screens. Technically, it's 9 screens. So, like, why do you have so many screens? I'm like, well, there are different perspectives, there are different frames, there are different uses, and realizing that means my attention to some extent is kind of split between these different screens, right? And nobody's unfamiliar with that idea, but or the amount of like rancorous opposition many of our species have to that type of splitting of our attention, or that type of putting ourselves with our psyche into a cold machine, right? Like, it's not the warm body of us is not meant to be 100% inside the machine. We see this concept played out across all sorts of sci-fi. Nobody is unfamiliar with the philosophy here. I think people are lacking the vocabulary to like articulate to themselves and to others exactly what they want to be talking about. So we do a lot of talking around things, which is kind of how public discourse tends to work. And usually good facilitators or mediators or people who can hold space, hold a room together, and communicate and help facilitate communication are really helpful people under those circumstances. And one thing that I think I am seeing a trend of is a lot more of those people emerging sort of as a default of our social contracts and social machines. You're seeing so much rapidly advanced, socially deft people kind of just because of memes, and I really think that's the power again of the people and not the power of the machines or the people with the money who are like making and operationalizing those machines for the exploitation of the people. It's really about the people's attentional power that is so powerful, right? It's so meaningful, and this one like really obvious goal for this project of being like, hey, let's from the desk of like the streamer perspective, right? Because everyone's familiar with streaming now. The intimacy of streaming and gaming is kind of too much for me personally. Another reason I find it really hard to get into gaming is because of how like intertwined and close gaming and streaming really are. Which is one reason this is so funny that I'm like, oh, I'm gonna be a streamer but not a gamer. But this is a platform that is familiar to enough people that it can work as a message distribution space with the dissipating effect that occurs when you talk into a group of widely different people. I'm not sure exactly how to explain this. And again, especially what I'm about to talk about right now is not coming from my like education, although can you really separate education and enrichment from the person that grows out of it? But not so much directly coming from my education psychology or social psychology so much as it's coming from my experience as a very social creature who really enjoys different groups. And I think that, you know, that's always been something that threatens people, that I can cross between groups, because that's a very normal thing to feel threatened by. That's a very natural human response, is to be threatened by somebody who seems to be able to move between groups with relative impunity. You have to start wondering if they're like a liar or a sneak or a cheat. That's sort of where the suspicion of gypsies comes from. Yeah, they were one of the ones persecuted in the Holocaust. I'm holding that number, like all of those people, who it was that they targeted during that like first global rise of just absolutely bald-faced fascism that we can collectively as a species point to in our history as something documentable that definitely did occur and that we all agree happened. That's significant just in itself, just to have an event like that, as tragic and absolutely horrific as the Holocaust was. But then to like think about all the different people who were targeted with nuance and like attention to why they were targeted, what kind of philosophy was going on behind that decision making, and how can we prevent it in the future. That is the shit, like that. And that's, a lot of people have already done this. Like a lot of the work for this kind of thing has already been done. So I don't spend a lot of time like actively trying to do this sort of thinking in the world, but it's something I'm pondering. And gypsies were one of the groups that were targeted during the Holocaust, and they can move between borders, and that's partially why, like, the fear of gypsies comes from this idea that the outsider is going to steal from you. And I think it's like take your children is one of them too. You see this theme come up with gypsy characters, gypsy-like characters, tinkerers, anybody who's like kind of from out of town, a nomad maybe, and it makes sense as far as if you're taking the perspective of like conflict theory, like everything comes out of conflict to certain, like every societal change comes out of a certain amount of conflict at some level. Thinking about like the kind of conflict between nomadic cultures and stationary like city-state townships that really started to emerge around well, never mind, I'm not getting into details, but this like fear of the outsider. And I'm not trying to make the lofty claim that I am a gypsy-like person, because I don't think that people who identify as like Romanian necessarily like being called gypsies in the first place. And using the word I feel gypped is actually a slur, just for the record. That was a new one for me. I didn't know that. And my family, like, we have a lot of lore in my family about being kind of like like gypsy witches, and I take that with a grain of salt in the same way I take every Wiccan pagan lore with a little bit of a grain of salt. But at the same time, you know, it's Esmeralda was my favorite like Disney princess growing up, and she didn't even count as a Disney princess. Like, what the fuck, you know? Hunchback of Notre Dame was a work of goddamn art. But this idea of like the outsider, the person who can go between groups with a certain amount of impunity, is an important human being, and that's why I likened it to diplomacy. You know, we have embassies, we have these different structures and roles in our global social contract that already have like space for these types of communicators. And so what I did with the first like round of album creation and project projection was categorize myself into a similar role using new mediums of communicating that I feel reach a broader audience with broader effect, with the intention of like positivism, education, facilitating better perspectives, better, more positive perspectives for the future of our species. I think I was speaking either in the last episode or this one. Yeah, we're doing like a whole day marathon, so the thoughts are going to be scattered between. But I was talking about how hardcore environmentalism is, and it really is hardcore because once you start fully internalizing this idea of like a deeply interdependent microbial level network of like life on this earth, you cannot unsee the spaceship like quality of the biodome and how, you know, protective the ozone layer is, and it shows up just everywhere. I have never seen, and I tend to be somewhat of a connoisseur of worldviews, but I've never seen a worldview that is so encompassingly monolithic and unmovable and unflinchingly the same across people and culture and all sorts of different types of human beings. The worldview of environmentalism or concern for our global environment as it relates to like the continued existence and potential ability to thrive of the human species. Because again, humans are the thing that is being threatened. The earth will recover. Humans won't. Humans are the ones. So like environmentalism is about creature care at a human level by human creatures, and that is a really difficult one. But like I just mean it's challenging. Like if it was a skill tree, there would be a lot of unlocked or like locked stuff for humanity still if that ideology was a skill tree, because there's just not enough data about our environment in a broader like between galaxies kind of way for us to have a fully integrated and informed understanding of it. There isn't even enough data about our environment as far as like the depth of the Mariana Trench, although I think that particular factoid is quite outdated. But there is a certain amount of overwhelming that gets naturally provoked when confronting truths that are so axiomatic and so immovable and so overwhelmingly implying certain things about the world, like the existence of species that might as well be gods, but they aren't gods. They have no reason to care about you. They have no reason to consider themselves like caretakers or caregivers of you, right? My thing though, and again, I know I always revert to like, let's think about the nuance and like consider it within the spectrum, but really consider it within the spectrum if there is such an such a like powerful alien creature, which there would of course have to be some kind of like the most apex predator, right? Oh wait, that doesn't exactly exist within our understanding now of like biology and environment. Apex predator is just like out the door as far as ideas go, and that like once you start really integrating that, there are a lot of implications for other attitude networks that just like almost cascade effect, like dominoes just change. They just flip. You go, oh my god, it makes sense. And there's a lot, but you have to internalize like facts about the environment. And if Al Gore taught me anything, is that people are very, very resistant to internalizing facts about the environment, like very resistant. And so obviously, along with plenty of other people, I've been pondering the whys and wherefores of all of that, and like how to help people, because I don't think that being resistant to understanding our environment or being intentionally blind is ultimately going to be good for our species. So how do you like help encourage people to be thoughtful, curious creatures who are exploring their environment with like a desire for wonder and joy, in a way that like genuinely helps them become autonomous, self-actualized, self-directing creatures? I think one of the implications to me, like from a statistical angle, of environmentalism is this knowledge that proportions are always going to be real. Proportions are just this thing, and it's going to be the same in environment. And so if you think on a more galactic scale, if you consider humanity and our solar system within the context of our galaxy, and you assume that there is life scattered throughout our galaxy at relatively the same rate of advancement as us, a whole lot more people in the room than we really thought there were, right? Like that puts them in the bucket with us if we're at the same level of advancement, relatively speaking, right? That spectrum of technological advancement. We're in the same room. And I definitely am doing that thing that you shouldn't do in statistics, where I'm making a lot of inferences about a single sample, aka the human species, and applying it in a very generalized way at all other potential life in our galaxy. And that's a thing that you should just never do. So I should probably assume that all other life within our galaxy, assuming it's sentient in relatively the same way that we're sentient, then would have kind of a 50-50 chance of being like a threat to us or not. Right? Kinda, it's actually going to beg the question of whether or not we're competing for resources. Are we competing for resources? Can we have the conversation about competing for resources from a probabilistic and speculative perspective, based on what we know the available resources in the Milky Way galaxy actually are, and our relativistic position to those resources and to other creatures who may also be in the galaxy, and at our relatively similar level of technological advancement, which just means, assuming that's true and that we're all, so the reason I'm assuming we're all at the relatively the same level of technological advancement is because we are this close to one another in space, and because space is expanding at an exponential and also infinite rate, that means that whatever life is here in theory is evolving at And so this whole, like, yes, the answer is yes. You could mathematically, probabilistically speculate on the likelihood of it, like, alien life that could become a threat to us or might not be a threat to us based on the level of their technological advancement compared to ours. We have reached mutually assured destruction on our own planet. So that leads me to believe that there is a significant amount of alien life in our galaxy that has reached a very similar threshold. And the conclusion that I'm drawing is that means that we are all relatively evenly matched, and that the things that are going to make us stand out in the competition, the brutally violent competition of existence, is going to be our psychic capacity to stay dynamic and present within space and time. It's going to be the obvious advantage there. And so when you think about that, then you start thinking about, yeah, I know, this is why I never went into the military. I was like, I don't want that type of thinking all the time. I'm going to think that way anyway. Because I love sci-fi and fantasy and speculative future and speculative past. I love doing, like, the math of people and trying to guess things. It's my favorite fucking thing to do. It's super fun. But when you start guessing out into, like, all of space and time and the likelihood of rare earth, I don't find it compelling from all the evidence we have that this is like a rare phenomenon. And I guess we do have, like, documented evidence now, right? The government finally released all of its intel about what it knows of alien life. I haven't read it, to be honest. I'm pretty salty at the government right now for obvious reasons, and plenty of people are, but I'm, like, personally offended by the entire US government. I know that's ridiculous, but I do tend to treat entities as though they are on par with me, or rather as though I am an entity. It's very convenient. Really, you get rid of a lot of roadblocks when you start treating yourself as an entity on par with, like, Google or the government. It gets you in trouble too. It's totally, like, generally that type of thinking is how people get caught for criminal activity. But I don't do criminal activity. That's kind of my thing, is, like, I'm not criminal, but I think of myself as an entity on par with, like, syndicate crime or the government or Google or whatever. Super not great health-wise, and I've been reorienting a lot of different things internally to, like, move away from that because it's a problem. But self-perception of being that big, also amorphous, which is another reason it's a problem, but being that big is kind of useful when you want to think about these entities as though they are movable pieces on a board. So obviously I'm not the only person who thinks like that or who organizes it in that way, but I think it's worth pointing out because I think that there is a significant advantage for our species in our ability to communicate with each other without words. And I think that, I'm sure, I would assume life evolves in a very similar way, especially carbon-based life, where that ability to communicate without words is just, it's everybody. It's the trees. As far as we know, the trees also talk like that. So there is definitely empirically a universal language that all carbon-based life speaks. So in theory, you can speak in that language across time and space, psychically, and kind of form loose associations with your neighbors, which I think is the appropriate level of connection that we should have as a galaxy at this point in the human advancement. Loose associations with our neighbors. I'm guessing it's a little more intimate than that, honestly. But like, I'm just a fan of space. I like to have my own space. I like my own independence, despite how much I value interdependence. And one of the fun positivistic mathematical conclusions of all of these different ways of thinking involves the obvious implication that all of this math is designed to extend our experience of existing. And not just our experience, but any potential alien is also kind of, by default, working to extend their own experience of existing. So it turns out life enjoys living. Tautologies abound. But it's worth remembering, because sometimes we get really caught up in the struggle of the suffering, and that it's valid. The mortal coil is designed to be immediate and pressing and honestly breaking us down to the fundamentals. I'm not going to say like it was designed by a god or an alien and that we live in a simulation, or maybe humans designed it to give ourselves more time to develop. I don't know. But I do think it's positive. Like, I think it just arcs positively in a good direction. And another one of the little, like, mind games we all play with ourselves when it comes to the problem of evil, good versus evil, virtuous or not virtuous, is this a positive direction or a negative one? All of these different dualities of extremes between good and bad that we're constantly working to reassure ourselves we're not bad. I think it's a fundamental type of reassurance we need in response to the horror of existence and like, why are we here, but also why does it have to end? I am a strong believer in terror management theory, but the silver lining here is that we don't want it to end, right? The silver lining is that we can, if we autonomously choose to, if all life within this galaxy autonomously chooses to do so, we could extend the amount of pleasure and joy we get as a species from existing within our ecological niche, not as conquerors, but as farmers, turning those swords into plowshares, but keeping the lore of how to turn plowshares back into swords, right? Like, our blacksmiths are very important creatures for reasons. They are alchemists, obviously. Yes, they are. It's true. They use like salt water versus fresh water. They have like bellows to change the level of heat in the, it's not called a kiln. Gosh, I'm not good with metallurgy. Not my sphere. But yeah, we could actually what I would call stabilize the gestation period for our species advancement as actualized intellectuals, which I think a lot of us want to see. I think a lot of us want to see what human beings are capable of doing when most of us are relatively comfortable actualized intellectuals. I think we're excited about a future where what that looks like. But if we were able to do that in a galaxy-wide way, it would, again, extend the gestation period of our collective, our species. Like, developmental period. Of course, different carbon-based life develops differently. But our species definitely needs some more time to, like, just get there. And one of the fundamental arguments this often brings up is, like, get where, right? People are always seeing those two roads. It's just like we become massive warmongering conquerors so that no other alien species dominate us, because to be dominated is the worst thing ever in the world, or we become peace-loving, soft, pleasure-seeking creatures who are relatively naive and overly friendly and incapable of self-protection. There always seems to be these dualities for our future as a species. I would argue it's because we generally fall into two sexes, and our biochemistry leans us towards considering things within the structure of dualities. And as I mentioned, the double helix structures have shown up in our social structures throughout history and have proven to be very, very effective in storing information and data across like catastrophe, time, space, and all sorts of traumatic experience, loss of written record, all sorts of things, right? Like, we have a lot of information about the way the human species has passed on information, and we actually think we're doing a pretty good job. I think so. Having access to both what kind of questions to ask, which is its own type of access, but then the ability to, research stuff with a certain amount of ease of access to different libraries and resources. I think we're pretty self-satisfied as a species in our ability to pass on info. And at the end of the day, this argument, this like overarching struggle between like, are we gonna become, are we gonna go to the dark side because the dark side has cookies, or are we going to become more than what we were before, and maybe we could become a creature that holds both the softness of our bodies and the strength of our ability to dominate both intellectually and physically, because we are pretty studly in that sense, right? Like, as a species, yeah, we got the domineering stud muffin capacity going on. Very solid on that. I don't think we need, there's no notes. Like, we're very good. We've gotten mutually assured destruction down, which means that we are good at this. But I wonder if there's other things we could be better at. And I think right now, in the present global theater, there are very obvious exemplars on display of how we could become better at acknowledging and honoring the social interconnectedness of all human species. Yeah, I'm talking about China. They've been working on that for so long. You have to give them the props. Oh my god, what a collab between the citizenry and the government. That was solid work. Friendly, inviting, interesting, like tourism vibes without being overly like, yeah, oh my god, so natural. Amazing job. Like, what else would you call it when somebody socially debuts into a sphere? Red Note was definitely a social debut into a sphere, right, as the American government yanked TikTok, right? Or did they give it back, but only if you're willing to, in some ways, psychologically associate with fascism, right? Like, there's an obvious global interconnectedness on display in the present day, and while I'm not always coming on to comment on it, I am watching and like thinking good, positive thoughts. One of the biggest challenges to speaking into a sphere so large is like kind of getting crushed and deciding to never speak up again, in which case it becomes a singular event and no longer a living experience. But then there's also the likelihood of fucking up, or of alienating certain groups, or violating certain social schemas that are deeply important and integral to people. Like, there's just it's not always gonna go well. The only thing that I thought would be important was to make sure that it's frequent, like it's happening, like it's continuing to happen, so that it continues to build this perception of like, no, this is a living experience that we are all sharing. This is a shared living experience, and that lack of continuity is exactly what's present in the Orwellian structure for information campaigns, basically. And it's also, I would argue, a reason that people have become so quickly adapted to critical thinking and being really good at testing theory and ideas about the world and whether or not something is true or it hangs together or it's well sourced, or all of that type of literacy has exploded within the last 10 to 20 years. It's because we're talking to each other and it's making us more sophisticated, and we are social creatures, so we are being given this exceptionally beautiful social tool to use. It doesn't even matter if the tool is bad, if it's poorly built, or if it's built to exploit you and your data. It still benefits you so much more than it benefits off of you. But you can't do anything with that level of benefit if you aren't recognizing it or operationalizing it or understanding it, which is unfortunately where a lot of people are at. That's the point of like, we need to self-actualize people. It's not just enough to educate them. It's not just enough to make them literate. You have to like make them want to make autonomous decisions. You have to make them want to like live for themselves and be free and like move through the world of their own autonomous decision making, while hopefully ensuring that they stay well informed. Like that's the goal of any well constructed society, is going to be to have autonomous like citizenry who are also well informed and making decisions both for their own health and for like the mutual benefit of all others. I mean, ideally, right? That's the idea of the utopia. And back in the day, when people started really throwing around the idea of the utopia versus dystopia, it was very grim, you know, and you see that in the writing, you see that in the way that it was written. It was very, very fucking grim. It was like, God, I don't know if we can do this, but I, an intellectual, am gonna put pen to paper, hands to keyboard, or whatever, and try to articulate what I imagine the potential roadblocks are going to be for the society that I am observing, because I don't see anybody else doing that. I don't see anyone else writing down like what I think might be a challenge, or what I think might be a strength, or what I think, you know, and we see that kind of storytelling in a variety of different ways across a variety of cultures. It's not always categorized as dystopian or utopian. There are a lot of different ways for storytellers to consider the future or the past, and to use their knowledge of those things to empower their audience, or inspire their audience, or help orient their audience towards a more useful avenue of thought. That's the whole point of a storyteller. So when I'm thinking about Orwell, for example, I am thinking of a guy who was relatively privileged in his positionality at the time as like a well-educated person. Like anybody at the time that he wrote that. As far as like who was getting educated to that level, not a lot, right? Like, oh my God, was he even an educated person? I don't even know. I'm like, American literature is so, is so like squirrely difficult to get your hands on. Okay, here we go. Britannica, thanks Britannica. Bengal, India. Ha! He was born in India. Fucking knew it. Oh, and he died in London. Okay. Yeah, English novelist, essayist, and critic famous for his novels Animal Farm in 1984. Yeah, it's a profound anti-utopian novel that examines the dangers of totalitarian rule. Ah, how fucking salient. But yeah, one of the biggest things I noticed in Orwell's depiction of like what he was predicting for the future based on the trends that he was seeing in his life and in the world around him, was this lack of continuity in knowledge for the average person. Like, one of the biggest things he underlined as a potential danger for our species within the context of a social contract, within the context of a single society, was that our the threat of an entire populace not having any sense of continuity of knowledge. And I think that that is a sincerely genuine threat, a really good observation, and part of the fear that underlines a lot of xenophobic behavior and ideology, because this idea of a lack of continuity of structure that goes beyond a human lifespan means that the social contract you've spent your life embedding yourself in and dedicating your energy to, the stuff that you don't get literally paid to do, but that you do because you know it benefits yourself and your immediate family and the people around you. All of your spheres of influence benefit from your sociability, and so you participate in everything that goes along with that, whether it's in an institutional format or a less structured format. People are always going to be participating in these things. And the threat to a lack of continuity of knowledge of how to participate, or under what conditions, under what, like, in what ways, what institutions, what norms, all of these things being so dynamically changeable that they could change day to day, that's not a livable world. And so this idea of, like, institutions changing too quickly, or being able to control the type of information that the masses have, is a huge, real threat in the shape of Google. For example, they have digitized the most amount of old knowledge or non-digital knowledge in the world that I know of, but I am an American, so I might only know the American one, because all of the nations have gotten, after that initial outburst of, like, exploratory technological discussion, have gotten very careful about the sorts of things that they allow other nations to know about where they are at when it comes to technological advancement. That's just where we're at. It's a dark forest sort of situation. But the lack of everybody mutually assuredly destroying each other does imply a certain reluctance to completely decimate our environment, which, despite how grim everything is actually kind of a good indication of where we're at collectively. It's a really grim positive indication, but it is a nice one that I think of often. Well, at least nobody's creating nuclear winter yet, you know? Like, hand to heart, hope that continues. I really do. But it's that fear of, like, absolutely no continuity is really what Orwell is speaking to when he talks about, like, the way the wars in the global theater are consistently moved around the map and discussed in a variety of confusing ways that doesn't seem to stay consistent or the same generation to generation. Like, he's literally outlining this plan. I'm like, was it a plan? Was it a plan all along? Is there a deep state American government whose entire plan was to create actualized autonomous individuals with a sense of, like, real freedom and empowerment? Because that's what I grew up believing in. That's the America that I grew up believing in. And I'm just like, was I just indoctrinated to think that through